episode on hand-holding. Today's episode is on the therapeutic effects of hand-holding, and it's also on the social regulation of emotion, but I'll get to that in a moment. So hand-holding, as we all know, is a way to express our emotions about other people. It's a way to create a relational context. It's also a way to hang on to our kids. But what most of us don't realize is that it's also a way to dampen down the threat response in our brain. It's a way to help us regulate our state and feelings, and it's a way to help us improve our behavior. So let me just mention that hand-holding, I think, is a very special case of social regulation of your body, of emotions and feelings, and a very powerful one. But the fact is that we're all social beings, and we spend most of our time regulating each other, or alternatively dysregulating each other. So let me give you an example of that so you know what I'm talking about. And there's a study with anxious kids, and these are kids who have diagnosed anxiety disorders. And they go in for a medical procedure, and there's two different conditions. They either go in alone or they go in with their parents. And in the case where they go in alone, their anxiety is very high. Just going in with their parents brings their anxiety down significantly. And in fact, if you look at kids who are in the control group who don't have anxiety disorders, the kids who go in with their parents have less anxiety than the normal kids. One of the interesting things I think about that study is that the site in the brain in which they find this activity is the hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus is the core of your stress response. So your hypothalamus tells your pituitary to tell your adrenals to kick out all these stress hormones. And when it does so, it throws you into the fight-flight response. And, you know, if there's a tiger in the room, that's fine. If there's not, it's probably going to end up with some bad behavior. Okay. So unlike all the other techniques, we don't really have to demonstrate hand-holding. I think most of us know how to do that and have done that for quite some time. So I'm going to get into a couple of examples, how I got interested in it, and a clinical case that I can talk about a little bit. So the first is that, you know, somewhere around 8 or 9 years ago, we took this young lady who's quite traumatized and behaviorally disordered and emotionally dysregulated and all that sort of stuff. Lots of bad behavior, in other words, out of an institution. And from the moment she came out, whenever she was in a stressful situation, which the first year was nearly all the time, what she'd do is reach for your hand. And she continues to do the same thing. Anytime we go into a new situation where she'll reach over and hold your hand. And I thought that was interesting, but to be perfectly honest, I wasn't all that comfortable with having somebody hold my hand, other than my wife and my kids maybe, or some other people. But we allowed her to do it. And you know, most recently we had a group down from Canada who were interested in the work we're doing, and they wanted to see it. And so they interviewed her. And she sat next to me in a chair, and the entire time she just held on to my hand. So she was really, I went from thinking this is something she likes to do, to sort of looking at the research on it and realizing it's an attempt on her part to regulate herself. And so I think about it entirely differently now, thanks to her. And that's when I went to look at this research on hand-holding. You know, the second example I want to give you is another lady who I've seen just in therapy for quite a while. And she's very dysregulated. She happens to have autism. And her way to cope with her anxiety or her feelings is to rock. And she rocks pretty strongly and pretty quickly. And, you know, it's just a sign of her anxiety. If she stops rocking, you know she's less anxious. So the first couple sessions we had with her, we did some power posing. And power posing, as you know, doesn't require any touch. And sometimes people with autism or other people who've been traumatized, you have to be very sensitive about touching them at all. Anyway, the power posing worked pretty good, and we worked into doing some tapping with her. And tapping requires hand holding. So the first couple steps is you hold their hand and tap. And I always leave my hand available. I don't make people hold my hand, but after I'm done with the hand tapping and go to the head, I keep my hand available. And she would hang on to it pretty firmly. But what's interesting is when we started the tapping, as soon as she held my hand, the rocking stopped. So it was a sign that this hand holding was doing something very special physiologically to her and making her much more available. And over time, what we developed was when we had things to talk about with her, or she had things to talk about with us, we'd actually bring in a couple trusted support people, and they would sit on either side of her and hold her hand. And there was one particularly difficult moment for her, and I think for all of us. And it was after a round of tapping, she was holding my hand, and her hands got really firm and sort of, it felt like every inch of her hand was engaged with part of my hand. And she told us about this very traumatic abuse that had happened to her years earlier. And she told it in a way we didn't really think she was capable of. And I attribute that entirely to the hand holding. So it's a simple thing, hand holding, but it's powerful enough to allow people to tell their stories, and even if those stories are very painful. So let me go right into some of my favorite research on it, because we don't have a demo to do. In order to do that, I have to talk about James Cohen from the University of Virginia, who did the first study on hand holding. And he developed a hand holding study kind of research technique. And what he does is he brings couples to the lab, and he puts one of the couples in an fMRI machine, and he threatens them with shock. It's kind of an interesting thing to do. I would highly encourage you to see his TED Talk, because it's interesting, funny, and informative. But anyway, he puts you in fMRI machine, threatens you with shock in 3 different conditions. The first condition is you're alone. The second condition, you're with a stranger. In this first study, the stranger is a research assistant who happens to be in the room, and then with some trusted partner, or some spouse, or friend, or somebody else. And I'll tell you about each one of those studies in a moment. But just like Megan interested me in this whole idea of hand-holding, he has a story he tells about how he got interested in it, and what really drove this early research, and he continues to research this topic. So he's also a clinical psychologist and not just a researcher. And he had a fellow who was a World War II veteran who had developed the symptoms of PTSD. And the fellow came to see him in the clinic, and Dr. Cohen explained to him what the treatment would be, some combination of progressive muscle relaxation and exposure therapy, talk about some of the things that had happened to him. And so he came into the clinic, and when Dr. Cohen explained to him, he said no, he refused to do it. And he was with his wife, and his wife reached over and touched his hand, and she said, we could do this together, and then he agreed to do it. So he said he'd do it under one condition, which is that his wife was allowed to come to all the sessions. Dr. Cohen had never been asked to do something like that before, and he said, that seems reasonable enough. And he says later on that he didn't realize that she was an intimate part of the treatment, because at each point where he became avoidant and backed up and couldn't go on his own, she would reach over and touch his hand and hold his hand, and he would be able to engage in the treatment. And it turned out the treatment was quite successful. And so Dr. Cohen was intrigued what had actually happened there, and what role had hand-holding played. So the first study he did was in 2006. And again, he got these couples into the lab and put one of them in the fMRI machine and threatened to shock her, and then saw when she was alone, when she was with a stranger, holding hands with a stranger, and when she was holding hands with a spouse, what the reaction in her brain was. And he stacked the deck on the first study because he wanted to maximize the impact of hand-holding. So what he did was look for couples who were highly satisfied with each other. And he started out with about 600 people, and he ended up with 16 very satisfied couples. What he did unintentionally, of course, is selected for other things. So he found that the final group of 16 was all white. They were highly educated, and they were high SES. They had lots of money. So in that study, he put the woman in the fMRI alone, and found that the threat response in her brain was very high. And in the second part, she held hands with a stranger. It actually dampened down her stress response. And in the third part, she held the spouse's hands, and again, highly satisfied couples. And what they found is that there was no threat response in the brain. So hand holding is really, really an effective way to help people regulate their bodies. I've mentioned threat a couple times. I should probably explain what threat is and what it does to your brain. So clearly, being told that you might be shocked is a threat. But lots of people experience even just changes in their environment as potential threats. And so when you do, your brain's anticipatory anxiety goes up, your arousal goes up, your vigilance goes up, your mind-body connection gets strengthened to sort of know what's happening with your body, with the threat, and your frontal lobes get fairly active in planning and anticipating what to do in the threat situation. So in other words, threat ties up your brain. It's unavailable to do other things, like engage with other people and reason. One of the interesting things about that is that most of the interventions we use, or many times, when we want people to engage and be reasonable, we put them in a threat situation. We offer them consequences and talk about their behavior, and they're unable to reason and engage, the very thing we want them to do. So I'll tell you a little bit more about the studies, and maybe there's some help for us in there. The second study that they do is on dissatisfied couples. The first one's satisfied, very satisfied, in fact. The second one is very dissatisfied couples. There are a lot more couples, and many of them are on the verge of divorce. So they bring them in, they put them in the alone, stranger, and couple situation. And in the couple situation, not only does it not dampen down their stress response, but they actually find that in some cases, in some areas of the brain, they're more activated when they hold hands. They feel more threatened. So is there a way around that? I mean, what can you do about that? And so they put them in 20 weeks of EFT, which is emotionally focused therapy. And after 20 weeks, they redo the hand-holding task. And what they find is that after 20 weeks of therapy, in the hand-holding situation, when their relationships have improved, the hand-holding diminishes the threat response in the brain and quiets the whole brain down. So I think there's a lesson for all of us in there. The third study is a more recent study, and it's actually 2017. And in the 2017 study, he wanted to diversify the population that he looked at. And so the first study was all white people, high SES, high education. This is a very diversified sample, Latino, black, white, and not upper middle class kind of people, but lower SES. And in fact, many of the people come from what he terms harsh environments, harsh communities. And that has a big effect on the outcome of the study. And also, he has not just couples who are married, but couples who are living together, couples who are just dating, and then also just good friends, non-romantic partners. And what he finds across the boards is, the highest response when they're alone, and very good dampening down a threat response when you're hand-holding with somebody you care about in any of those categories. But the stranger effect changes. So in the first study, if you recall, holding a stranger's hand diminishes your threat response. In this case, it does not. In fact, it may elevate it somewhat. And, he says there's further research to do on that, obviously. But what he'd like to get to is what is the effect of coming through a harsh environment, and how does that affect this threat response in your brain? And it certainly makes sense. Our brains are customized by our experience. And so people who are in the high SES group, very safe, well-educated, all that stuff, they didn't come from these kind of environments where strangers might actually be a threat. So last couple things. One is a study by Jack Blanchard out of the University of Maryland, and he studies people with schizophrenia in a hand-holding situation, and he selects people who are poor on social skills, social abilities, social acuity, reading other people. And he puts them in a friendship task. And after doing the friendship task, which doesn't last very long, they go into the fMRI hand-holding with the person who they did the friendship task with, and that diminishes their threat response. So I think there's a powerful lesson for us in there, which is that just a little bit of time, if we invest in relationship work, can help us to be the kind of people who help them to regulate themselves. And then the last study is this just about emotional regulation, or is it a broader response of the body? And so there's a guy, Tor Wager, out of University of Colorado, and he's done research on pain attenuation and suffering, what he calls suffering. And what he finds is that not only does hand-holding diminish the threat response in your brain, it also diminishes your somatosensory processing of pain in your brain. So you feel less pain. And then the suffering part is it also diminishes the emotional reaction to that pain. So those are pretty important studies, I think. The takeaway lesson, I think, in all of this is, I hope I don't repeat myself too much, but this is all about the social regulation of emotion. Hand-holding is a very powerful way to help people regulate their state and diminish the threat. And so we ought to be thinking about how to help people engage and be reasonable by diminishing their threat response rather than encouraging it. So what I'd like to end with is then, so go forth and lend someone a hand.